Welcome back to Introduction to Autism and Developmental Disorders. This is the final video part, and we're going to cover objectives 20 through 22. Objective 20 is to identify and discriminate between elements of a practical education program. 21 is to identify steps of explicit skill instruction. And 22 is to identify the relation between behavior management and student responsiveness to instruction. So let's look at some program considerations. And what I mean by program is educational program. And so in addition to the autism characteristics and behavioral deficits and excesses we've discussed thus far, children with autism also demonstrate something called stimulus over selectivity. And that means they tend to selectively attend to the wrong stimuli or irrelevant stimuli in a given context. And it makes it harder for them to learn. Also they tend to demonstrate learning difficulties. A study just came out in 2018 that reviewed reading comprehension skills in children with autism and showed that the large majority of them had serious reading disabilities. And anyways, they commonly have learning difficulties, which make it unlikely that they will acquire the skills they need to be happy and live independently without being directly taught. And it can be very difficult to identify motivating items and activities conducive to learning. Now, that said, there is a full range of empirically supported behavioral technology validated by ABA researchers and professionals from other domains that can be used to develop and implement practical, comprehensive, and effective educational programming for most learners with autism. Now, practical education programming is characterized by the following, such as instructional procedures and assessments derived from ABA, clearly and carefully sequenced goals and objectives based on direct observation and behavioral assessment across academic and non-academic skill domains, direct instruction, which is also known as explicit instruction, a structured and predictable environment, functional behavior assessment, function-based interventions for challenging behavior, procedures that both increase desired behavior and reduce unwanted or harmful behavior. And all of this is implemented in the context of the evidence-based practice of ABA, which involves considering the best available evidence, in other words, the best available scientific evidence, and progress monitoring data with learner values and context, as well as your clinical or teaching expertise, all to ensure that the student meets their goals. And your book identifies elements of a practical educational program, and so we're going to go through these in detail one by one. The first is clearly sequenced goals. The goals you set for your student should take into account the current context and also the future context in which they will find themselves. You always have to be thinking about the future. Where is the student going to be in 6 months? Where are they going to be a year from now? Are they going to be 5 years from now? Are they going to be 10 years from now? Okay, and so that the sequence of goals, in other words, the curriculum that you develop for them, puts them on a trajectory to be successful in that next stage of life, the next context where they'll be living and learning and interacting with other people. So, for example, if a student will be transitioning to high school in a couple of years, the current goals should place the student on a trajectory for success in that setting. The second is explicit instruction of skills. So in explicit instruction, you have complex skills that are analyzed and broken down into simpler component skills that can be taught one at a time. And subsequently combined through instruction to teach the complex skill. Now, I'm just giving you a general overview of this because this type of thing is going to be a theme throughout the whole course. So also known as a drill and practice format, this type of instruction is systematic, direct, it's engaging, another way of saying motivating, success-oriented, that means you focus on a high rate of reinforced responding, high rate of correct responses, and can be characterized by the four-term contingency describing an operant, because in explicit instruction of skills using applied behavior analysis, you treat all student behavior as operant behavior, at least all the important behavior, and operant behavior is best described by a four-term contingency, which consists of the motivating operation, a discriminative stimulus, a target response, and then a set of consequent stimuli that control the future probability of that response in the presence of those similar or the same motivating operations or discriminative stimuli in the future. All right, so MO stands for motivating operation. The first S is the SD. The R represents the target response, and then the second S represents the consequence produced by the target response during explicit instruction. So explicit instruction is conducted in a trial-by-trial format, and trials are generally conducted as follows. Now I'm giving you an overview here, but we'll cover this in more detail when we talk about general teaching strategies in a subsequent unit in this course. The teacher obtains the student's attention, they present a stimulus, the teacher prompts the correct response, the teacher waits for the operationally defined target response, and the teacher gives a consequence, or withhold a consequence based on the student response. So a very simple example of this. I can say my son's name, Owen. He looks at me, I present a letter, a little foam letter, it's an A, and I say, and I tell him, what letter? And then if he hasn't learned that yet, I'll prompt him and I'll say, A. So I say A, and then he says A, that's the target response. And then the consequence would be me saying, oh, good boy, yeah, that is an A, nice job. Right? And over time, what I would do is I would gradually fade out my prompt while continuing to reinforce less prompted responses, that is more independent responses, such that I can present a little foam letter A and say, Owen, he looks at me, I say, what letter? He says A all by himself, and then I give praise for answering correctly. Right? And so explicit instruction can be implemented one-on-one or in a group, and this approach makes learning more probable and enjoyable by making instruction very clear and providing assistance and feedback. Now the teacher collects data on student responding, graphs the data, uses the graph data to inspect the student's progress, and then decide whether to continue, revise, introduce a new goal, or modify instructional strategies. And these steps help to prevent the teacher from spending time on mastered skills or failing to teach the student what they need to learn. Next is behavior management. Behavioral excesses that are barriers to learning must be reduced and replaced with adaptive behavior, such as the strengthened Manding repertoire. And functional behavior assessment, perhaps including functional analysis, is conducted to identify the function of the challenging behavior. And if you took 3633 classroom management, you're wondering if that's, if this is the same thing. Yeah, this is the same thing we talked about in that class, functional behavior assessment consisting of indirect assessment and direct assessment consisting of the descriptive assessment, structure assessment, functional analysis, right? And on the indirect assessment side, you have grades, scales, questionnaires, interviews, and records review, right? So you do all that to identify the function of challenging behavior, right? And then you develop a function-based intervention to replace challenging topographies of behavior with a socially appropriate alternative behavior. And so, of course, I'm talking about behavioral support at the level of the individual. So, in other words, Tier 3 level support. Now, when the teacher, often in collaboration with other then the teacher, in collaboration with other special education professionals, develops, implements, and evaluates a function-based behavioral intervention plan. This is what I just said, I guess. To replace challenging topographies of behavior with socially appropriate alternative topographies using differential reinforcement and perhaps other empirically supported interventions as needed. Next is an ecological assessment. Now, this is an assessment that's used to identify the skills a student needs to function independently in settings with people or situations that are frequently encountered. That's the key to an ecological assessment. Frequently encountered events. They're frequently encountered on a daily basis, such as the child's classroom, a bathroom, living room at home, the kitchen, daycare setting, etc. So the way this works, just roughly, in a rough overview here, is the teacher selects an assessment tool and uses direct observation and interviewing, combines the results of those assessments to construct an inventory of skills. This is just a list of skills that the student needs to learn, which is used to assess the student's current levels of functioning in those skills, and then determine which skills are mastered, which need to be taught, or which are taught but need to be strengthened or brought under appropriate stimulus control. In other words, teach the child to engage in those behaviors at the right place at the right time. It's important to include parents in this process, when possible, to increase social acceptability and ensure that the right skills are taught in the right context. Curriculum related to post-school adult goals. Now, oftentimes ecological assessment is focused on functional life skills, and those skills and tasks are ones that if the student could not do them on their own, someone else would need to do those skills for them. Okay, so we're talking again curriculum related to post-school adult goals, because we want our kids to grow up to be independent adults. Okay, so what are some skills or tasks that if someone didn't, if they were unable to do on their own, someone would have to do these things for them? Well, they would include necessary things like nail clipping, toothbrushing, making a lunch, getting dressed, starting to maintain a conversation in a workplace setting, and it really, important basic leisure skills like using a tablet to watch a Netflix show. Also, generalization programming. Now, sometimes typically developing children have difficulty with generalization, okay? So typically developing children. Typically developing college students. Y'all learn things in class or when you're reading your book that you don't generalize outside of that setting. And this, the point here is if typically developing children and typical adults have difficulty with generalization, wow, you can expect that children with autism have a great deal of difficulty with this. And generalization involves transferring skills from the setting in which they learn those skills to a novel, real-world setting in which the skill is important. Okay, so for example, learning addition in class and then using addition to keep track of points in a game at home. Generalization is far less likely for students with autism. So for both populations of students, generalization can never be assumed. You always have to plan for generalization. Integration and placement. Now, integration into settings that enable normalization of a student's life and interactions with others. So we're talking inclusion here. Is always a goal and is consistent with IDEA's 2004 least restrictive environment clause. However, and this is critical, inclusion does not always result in a student being placed in an environment where they are successful and learn best. So just as individualization is essential for selecting effective instructional procedures for students with autism, it's also essential that placement decisions are individualized to ensure that the student is maximally successful wherever they receive instruction. In other words, integration and placement, ultimately, ideally, would result in normalization of the student's life and have them fully included with individuals who do not have disabilities. But that's really only appropriate if including the child in such settings results in their success, right? If a child is not succeeding in a given context or environment, that environment needs to be modified, or they need to be placed in another environment where they can learn and thrive and be successful and independent. And over time, environments are modified while the student continues to be successful until that student ends up in the most normalized or inclusive environment. Okay. Now, I had not read anything about this before I came across your textbook, but I thought this was fascinating. I wanted to make sure we include it in our lecture here. They describe some teacher characteristics that seem to be associated with highly effective teaching for students with autism. So there's no one attribute that makes someone a good teacher of students with autism. That's true. And all of the complexities of the student population and educational and clinical environments in which instruction is provided seem to require a wide range of attributes found in highly effective teachers of students with autism. So here they are, and these are not this is probably not an exhaustive list, but it's probably a pretty good one. So highly effective teachers of students with autism are consistent. They are persistent, which means that they don't give up. They're flexible. They're creative. They demonstrate highly organized or high levels of organization, intuitive sensitivity to others, high energy. I cannot tell you enough how important high energy is working with students with autism or other developmental disorders. They have to like children. They have to like children, and think kids are cool, and enjoy even the smallest gains or improvements that children with disabilities make. And they should have highly effective teachers of students with autism tend to have well-developed sense of humor, mastery of applied behavior analysis and developmental theories, mastery of data-based instruction, and a commitment to the right to the most effective education or treatment. Now, if you look at this list and you self-assess and you think to yourself, oh gosh, I'm not sure if I have these characteristics. Well, the good news is you don't need to walk onto the job on day one and have these attributes, okay? I certainly didn't. I can tell you that. When I started working with students with autism, I probably lacked most of these characteristics. Okay, the good news is that you can acquire them over time through interactions with students or with someone skilled in these areas who can teach you. So I'd say if you don't have one or more of these attributes, find someone who does and ask them to teach you. All right, so we're going to wrap things up here with a personal perspective on autism, because everything that I've talked about here is from the perspective of psychologists, neuroscientists, educators, clinical practitioners, parents, and so forth. Well, I'd like to end this with a brief video clip of information from a young man with autism spectrum disorder. He's going to talk about some things he thinks it's important for you to know. So I suggest go ahead, pause the video, type that web address into your web browser and watch the video. Hope you enjoy it. I hope you've enjoyed this unit, and those are my references. And that's it. That wraps up this Learn module. So don't forget to submit your writing activity assignment so that your Learn and then your transfer your ASR answers over from your scratch paper into the ASR test, and then your Learn module will be complete. And yeah, I'll see you in class. And I should give you, let's see here, I'll give you a password for the ASR test. We'll say the password is PL890. Again, that's PL890. That's the password you'll enter into the Learn module so you can access the ASR test and enter your ASR answers. Alright, see you next time.